Welcome to 733 of Salsido Paranormal. I'm your host, James Salsido. I'm here again with the co-host of the show, Jen, the Arcane Observer. And tonight we'll be continuing our conversation about communications between the living and the dead. As always, just now it is a lot easier to do the intro because all I have to say is for all of my links, all the episodes, all the social media, all those things, excuse me, you can just go to salsidoparanormal.com. That's SALSIDO paranormal.com. And that has everything there that you could need for the podcast, including all the social media, all the ways to listen, and all the ways to support the show. And that is always appreciated, never expected. But we've gotten our first Patreon subscriber, so hopefully there'll be more in the future. But anyway, thank you all for being here, and let's get to this here. Jen, welcome onto the show. Thank you for joining me as always.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is sort of, I don't know, we could almost call this a separate show, but maybe not. It's sort of still related to last week. Just the larger concepts of communicating with the dead, or the spirits, or the other, or however you want to label it. And yeah, it's I did a little bit of research. I found a couple articles, and a lot of it was sort of review of things I already knew. But what's amazing to me about all this is how far back it probably goes in the past to people just thinking about people that they were close to that have passed on, and people having this idea or wondering where they go, what happens to them. Do they exist in any way after their body shuts down, so to speak? And just all the different ways that we could interact with them. So I'm happy to hear what you think about that to start with, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I think people have been talking with their dead for a long time, forever. I think that was probably sort of the way I think about it is that would be the first religion even. It'd be the first thing you would come from your mother, and your father. And then you would know that they had come from their mother and father. And then as they would pass away, or as people would, lose their lives, I think people would still kind of look to them as being kind of still prevalent and alive. If you look at a lot of the burials and stuff like that, they did act as if they believed that there was an afterlife of some sort. And then in all of their practices, or at least a lot of practices, there was this desire to continue to stay in contact with them, or at least to show a great deal of reverence on a regular basis. Like they would have they all have celebrations for the deceased, sometimes at different specific times and dates. But then also too, I think it's very specific to that individual a lot of times, like still on their birthdays and things like that. So I think it's a traditional thing to communicate with the deceased, even for an ancestral worship, basically. The communion with them, I think it would go as far as even, believing perhaps that they could be, live again through another descendant, that this continues on. It's a form of like immortality, basically. And so I think even, not just necessarily with reincarnation, but that you could continue to communicate with them. You could, reach out to them at any point in time to get answers to questions and things like that. And all the practices I've heard about, which are, you have the spirit boards that came up during the Spiritist movement, where they were doing a lot of automatic writing and things like that. And that was really neat, But I think prior to that even, you have the soothsayer, where they would speak for the dead, like whisper from the spirit, basically. And then, going forward, just all the advances with things like EVP communication and things like that, or that the noises are coming through a lot of voices and communication through digital devices, ever since with the telephone. And I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but it's almost, I think if I remember right, that initially the whole point with the telephone, with Edison, that he was trying to use it as a device to communicate with the dead, initially too, which is really interesting. But no, I think people have always communicated or attempted to communicate, probably more so than they do now, actually, even. In ancient times, I think that they were more believing in that than we do today, even.
Yeah, especially at least in this, from what I've heard, this part of the world, maybe I think it's the Western world I've heard in particular is sort of less connected to all that. And I've heard that in terms of just all the ways that we sort of separate ourselves from the process of taking care of the deceased once they passed on, as far as handling, dealing with I'm stumbling here, as far as putting them, finding a place for them and putting them there, and just literally dealing with every aspect of all of that instead of, in a lot of cases now, uh, having companies handle a lot of these things. And not to say that all of the companies are inherently evil or bad or out to take advantage of everyone. I think there's all kinds, but it's definitely we become, once the person passes, it's almost, from what I understand, I've heard over the years, it's people, for the most part, hand everything over to authority figures, and or whether it's medical or, again, people in the funereal professions. They hand most everything over to these people to deal with all of that once that has happened.
Yeah, they had very advanced funerary rites, and they were very personal. There were no funeral homes. They have the wakes and the way that they would mourn their dead in the past. There were these day-long rituals basically that would go on and on after the person passed away that I've heard about. You hear about with the Irish wake, the classic, Irish wake, where they kind of mourn in the most powerful way that they can to show, how much they loved the individual. And they would do this in their family homes, and they would move them through the entire town, and the whole town would follow in a sort of procession behind some of these deceased individuals who, depending on how much impact they had had, and typically it would have a massive impact on, the small areas they lived in. Everybody would know who they were. So it was a lot more intimate, I think. Even the way that they did it in, like, I've heard about in tribal scenarios, like in the jungles and things in South America, that there's a whole process of how they even handle all the material of the deceased. All of the not the possessions, but the literal body of the person, and how they handled that. And the gathering of all of those materials and what they would do with them. And that they didn't handle it carefully, it would cause that soul to become so frustrated and upset with what was happening during the decomposition, basically, that it could become an angry spirit. It could go crazy if they didn't handle it really in a specific manner. And I think that now, like when they moved into doing it in specific part, there were so many dead and people living in such tight spaces, and the population increasing as it would, and being around many strangers too, in like some of the city atmospheres. They would move it into, not everybody would have proper accommodations. I'm talking about now like Western Victorian era. So they would use parlor houses, and then from there, I think it did move into, the funeral homes handling it. As we drifted further and further away from that, maybe seeing it as being kind of a, maybe grotesque to do. Like, that there was a proper way that you bury a body. So the whole definition of what was proper to do or how to handle the deceased changed. And I think that the ghosts changed too with that in a way. I wonder about that. But yeah, I don't know. I think that you're right about the funeral aspect of it, the way that people handle it to begin with, and now how they handle it, how they process it.
Yeah, we've I think this has come up before in different shows, here on my show, and I imagine on your show, and then even over on Trouble Minds as well, here and there. But yeah, let me see here. I'm looking at the chat here. So yeah, it's just, hello everyone. Thank you for being here. But yeah, even with the way that, so for so long now, there's so many ghost stories around different parts of the world where people would be, if they were not buried in the way they wanted, or not taken care of in the way they wanted, they would come back. Their spirits would become restless, and that seems to be common just in so many places around parts of the world. So, and I think that is a form of communication back and forth. I mean, you have the people that are either are or are not trying to be mindful and be caring for the way they take care of those that passed on. And then in some cases they're not, and that's when you have, in some cases, activity that happens. And then there's also, I mean, I've heard and found so many accounts of people who have the ashes from cremation, the ashes of loved ones stored in their own homes today, even to the modern day. And as soon as they brought that home with them, there would be activity there, and it wasn't even always a matter of the spirit being unhappy. In some cases, it was the opposite. It was they were glad to be there with the family, their family members, which I also find really amazing.
Well, I think that it stands true that, the relationship you have with the person while they're alive and the kind of interactions you would have with them would be not much different, possibly not much different than how it is after they are deceased. So if you had a good, relationship with them and you were very close with them, I think it would continue on, or it could continue on, hypothetically, being the same way that they are exactly, or similar to how they were with you then. But if there was some other type of relationship, if the person was difficult to be around or something like that, or you didn't know them very well, but you were to take possession of their remains, or if you were to even their items, their personal effects, you could have a different experience with them than you anticipated having. Or even too, I think that it's possible that people were a lot more, maybe, I mean, this is actually just a hypothetical, but what if the world was more haunted in past times, or at least there was an acceptance of it, more so than there is now? Because people are often afraid of this now. And even if they knew the person, even if they were very close with the person, you'll hear that they don't want them around them. They can't handle it. So there's a whole process there that's entirely different. Whereas it might have been welcomed in the past, or it was okay for things to move around, or, maybe there was more of a haunted experience with people's deceased loved ones. Maybe there was an acceptance of it that was, they had a different approach to how they felt about it. But now, we're not only afraid of our elderly and dying or anything that's not quite right, but there's a fear of the deceased to such an extreme now, whereas in the past, like I say, they would, in the instances where they would have these very long processions and these very long watches over the dead, and how that began to shift to where you want to get the body out as quickly as possible, and put it in the ground, get it away as fast as possible. But then, in addition to that, there's the mourning process is different. It's more abrupt. And then people just want to move on and forget about it. I don't know, but it seems like the funerary rites are so dramatically different. But if you take into account the concerns of the tribal people, or even in classic wakes and things like that, there was a whole process of how you handled that, so that the spirit would not become itself, that the spirit itself would not become so discombobulated or so confused or frustrated that it could become crazy, or that it could become malevolent even. So I think that that's very interesting, and just the denial of that in the human, in personal psyche, could lend to a lot of the negative experiences people have, and how the shadow of that deceased person could become something terrifying to some people. So I think there's a whole process with that, and the communication with them specifically could help to fix, smooth that out, or it could complicate things more so for the person, where they can't tolerate it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it seems like, I mean, other than accepting all this as being possible and all of that, the two most common views that I hear and see these days are either it's all, none of it exists. There is no there's no such thing as spirits or an afterlife or anything unexplainable, or it's all evil. It's all demons. Anything that is happening that you can't explain, it must be negative. And that's neither of those things are helping it. I don't think in any way. Helping with the communication with anyone that's out there, whether it's loved ones or not. Any encounter is going to be colored by those two ideas, and so yeah, I think that's definitely a major thing here. Looking at the chat, White Like a Ghost says, my sister says ever since our brother died, she feels a phantom hand on her shoulder from time to time, and that's amazing. I hope it's a comforting experience, because it seems like I would guess it's meant to be more of a comforting or contacting and a comforting experience, not meant to be negative. I would guess, and I would hope. Yeah. So he responded there in chat. Yeah, I think it's comforting to her. Yeah. So there's so much of that. It's I had so I have a quick story about that. Not an experience I had, but my grandparents. We talked about this last time. After my grandma had passed, my older sister and her family moved into the house, and they owned it for a while. And they moved in while a lot of stuff from my grandparents was still being removed from the house. It was all being sort of collected and gathered out of there, because my grandparents have been in the house for 60 plus years, over 60 years, I think. So there was a lot of things there. And the first night that my sister stayed overnight there, she was just sleeping on like a blanket in the living room on the floor, because they didn't have anything set up there yet. And late at night, early in the morning, she heard the sound of an alarm clock going off out on the front porch. And the front porch is enclosed, but it's not heated, but it's all still enclosed and everything. And so that's where a lot of my grandparents' stuff was at the time. And my sister got up and went out onto the porch and found this alarm clock that, of course, was not plugged in, did not have batteries, going off as if it was plugged in. And it went on for a little while, and then it stopped. And we it's we would like to think that it was our grandma saying hello, and at least trying to communicate in that way. And of course, I mentioned before I had other experiences. So yeah, it's quite the amazing thing when you have those kinds of experiences. And I'm guessing those kinds of experiences, again, have gone back, as we said in the beginning there, throughout time. I really wonder about, there's no way to know for sure, but I really wonder what paranormal experiences look like way before any kind of modern technology with electronics and everything, and how much of it had to do with taking in the energy from around people, like the weather and all that, those kinds of things, as we talked about before as well.
Yeah, I think definitely, trigger objects basically too can be a source of power for the deceased. And I think that, when thinking about just the human psyche itself and how two things can be true at once, a person can be a good person, but they still have this shadow aspect to them. And when thinking about the world of the deceased and where that is and how is possibly so populated with the way, different types of spirits, and in certain locations, the fact that people move more frequently than ever nowadays, or at least maybe they take up habitation. They're not nomadic necessarily. People even in the old world, maybe they were more nomadic in some instances, but they'd still bring a lot of these aspects of their deceased with them, and they would hand those down to people throughout their generations. So the whole concept of keeping these objects that would be a remembrance of this belonged to, say, your great grandparents or their parents or so on and so forth. Whereas now, people have other people's items that they don't even know who they are. And they live in people's homes that they don't even know who they were. And they live on land that they don't know what it was, 100 years before or before that. And history gets blurred. but just the consciousness of what the human being is, and that there are people who embrace more or more denial of that shadow of themselves, and that can be displayed in a very negative way. So in the world of the dead, it's likely that you have that duality still there, and the mediator spirit having loved ones that you were very close with, when they would pass, it's the mediating spirit, basically, I think, where you have them on your behalf in that realm. Because if you hear stories about people who are sensitive, like children or even the elderly or just people who are sensitive to it, they encounter these entities regardless. And they are often wandering spirits, sometimes the hungry ghost concept. And these spirits of their loved ones, as a lot of these stories go, would be there to protect them in that realm, while they're sleeping and experiences like that. So this communication with people's own beloved deceased was very important, and it would just apply to people. It applied to animals too. And many people I've heard stories about people in these ancient cultures that they would even their favorite horse or their favorite dog or whatever would also be sent with them into the afterlife. So there's this sort of concept of that too, that there's a continuance on through that. Or if say a person inherits a loved one's pet, it does seem like it's a link in a way, but the denial of the deceased nowadays, that they are gone, I don't know that that's really a healthy way to approach it. And then we drift not into like a positive superstition, but into like a sort of empty superstition that is based off of just this gleaming off the surface of I had a negative experience or I had a positive experience, but I don't even know what I was talking to. That's where it becomes sort of dangerous or awkward, and could lead to a type of madness with their own psyche, the experiencer of the phenomenon. But the patterns of positive experiences could have to do with their own beloved ancestors being there with them.
Yeah. You cut out for just a second, but I got most of what you said. And but no, and I think too with all this is I think that spirits can be just as confused as the living can, and so there's always going to be times where communication doesn't go, ironically enough, as smoothly as we would like it to between people. And then of course there's always, and we'll get into this more I think in the next episode here, because we're just about out of time. But in cases where other spirits that are out there they're interested in communicating with somebody has no interest in communicating with them. So there can be, I think, a lot of confusion, a lot of negative, positive, all these intentions are out there, and so yeah, it's really amazing. But we're just about out of time here. Thank you again, Jen, for being on the show with me, and we'll talk to you again just in a few minutes here when we start the next episode.
Thank you, James.
No problem. And thank you all for being here. And I like I said, we'll include all these both the articles that I found in the episode description. And please be sure to check on all the links in every episode description to follow Jen and Michael Strange of Troubled Minds Radio. And through that, you can find everyone else that's on the station, on the network. So thank you all for being here, and we'll talk to you next time on Salsido Paranormal. Take care.